Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Simmons. I'm president of the Canadian Club Toronto. I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As a club, this is an acknowledgement of the important work we have to do and the responsibility we have in improving relations between nations and building understanding of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Today's event is in partnership with the Business Council of Canada. We look forward to hosting an exciting discussion on Canada's opportunity to lead in the energy transition. We're joined by Don Lindsay, Karn Manhas, Dave McKay, Susannah Pierce, and Nadia Theodore. All are executives from leading Canadian companies representing a range of sectors that each play a role in this transition. Before we hear from our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping instructions. Take note of the following. There'll be a click to switch stream button at the bottom of your screen that may help you if your internet is slow. The video quality may decrease, but the audio quality will remain strong. Once we get to the portion where you may be able to submit questions, you can click the questions tab, enter your question in the window, and it will be sent to our moderator. There's also a request help button located in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen that will offer you technical support. Let me take a second to thank our event sponsors, EY, PwC, and BLG. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit. We've been gathering people together for over 125 years. And it's because of our sponsors, partners, and members that we're able to do so. So thank you for your continued support. One of the traditions that we have at our club that hasn't changed since we've gone to this blended virtual model is a toast to our great country. So if you have a drink nearby, join me in a toast to Canada. To Canada. Now I'd like to turn the podium over to Elliot Cabell, partner and national climate change leader for PwC, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, David. I'm pleased to be here virtually in the room with you all today. You know, I was speaking with a colleague last week about the arc or storyline of the climate change industry practice in this country over the last 15 years. And there are many, and then on the virtual stage today, who have been working in the field for that longer. And you know, you may recall a time when working on climate change was considered to be the right thing to do. I remember I told people I wanted to work in climate change, and they sort of said, "Oh, that's very nice. That's a very good thing to be doing." And then about 5 years ago, I think coinciding or driven by the release of the recommendations from the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosures, the story changed to become about risks. And I think that culminated with Larry Fink's now sort of famous statement to CEOs in his January 2020 remarks that climate risk is investment risk. I've stolen that line and used it hundreds of times, and in conversations with many clients, including some of you today. What I find is that in the past 18 months, the story has shifted again. And now the conversation's really dominated by the opportunity. So we've gone from thinking about climate change as something that's the right thing or good to do, to something that's about managing risks, to something that's about seizing opportunity. And so when I heard that the Canadian Club of Toronto was pulling this event together, which I think is so topical, I just thought PwC absolutely had to be involved. And as the leader of PwC's climate change team, I have a unique opportunity and privilege to work on the opportunity from different sectors, provinces and territories, different types of clients. And I see opportunity everywhere. The key word from my perspective is seizing, right? If it was easy for Canada to seize the opportunity, we would do it. It isn't so easy. Seizing the opportunity requires us to understand and wrestle with the key decisions and trade-offs, uncertainty, practical challenges, political economy, and the nuances between clean and green, between transition and decarbonization. To seize our fair share of the opportunity, or maybe our aim should be to seize more than our fair share, we really need to understand the issue from different angles. And so I'm very excited to introduce our speakers today who individually and as a group, as a group from different sectors and geographies across the country, are just have perspectives that are critical to building our consensus on the issue. Let me introduce first Karn, the CEO and founder of Terramera. He's known as an ag tech industry pioneer, transforming how food is grown and the economics of agriculture. Dave is the president and CEO of RBC. You may have heard of it, Canada's biggest bank. He is reimagining the future of financial services to help RBC's clients thrive and communities prosper. Susannah, Shell Canada country chair, who's held many senior positions in energy and technology in Canada, the US, and Europe. And last but not least, Don, the president and CEO of Teck Resources. He's also currently the chair of the Business Council of Canada and a director of Manulife Financial Corporation. I'm thrilled also that we have Nadia moderating this discussion. Nadia leads Maple Leaf Foods' global government relations and public policy functions, developing and implementing the company's government and industry relations strategy. That's a great group. So I'm going to hand it over now to Don Lindsay for a quick introduction. Don?
Well, thanks very much, Elliot, and thank you to the Canadian Club Toronto for hosting this virtual session. And thank you to Dave, Susannah, Karn, and Nadia for joining the discussion as well. I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk to you about Canada's economic growth and how it is linked to global action on climate change. And when we were first planning for this event, I'd hoped we'd be able to get together in person, but clearly the pandemic had other plans. Fortunately, we've all gotten pretty used to speaking and engaging with each other virtually over the past 22 months, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get together in person in the not too distant future. 3 years ago, when I began my tenure as chair of the Business Council of Canada, the feeling of Canadian business leaders was that our country was in a difficult position, that there were significant economic challenges ahead, and it seemed to us that no one was paying very much attention. Sluggish GDP growth, declining private sector investment, and poor performance and competitiveness were just a few of the challenges. Now, there's no question that a lot has changed in the 3 years since. Clearly, the pandemic has affected how we work together, how our kids attend school or not, and also how we socialize and interact. But one thing hasn't changed, and it seems to us that people still aren't paying enough attention to these persistent economic problems. But I think we understand why. For most people, the big picture economy seems overwhelmingly large and complex. It's easier to watch it unfold, letting it happen to us, rather than taking action ourselves to shape it. But that isn't the story of the Canada we know. Canada became a prosperous nation with a strong quality of living, where people from all around the world want to live, work, and raise families because people took action to make it that way. Like the building of the Transcontinental Railway, connecting our nation coast to coast and setting the stage for our modern economy. Or the building of the St. Lawrence Seaway 75 years later, which brought Canadian products to the world. And over 30 years ago, there was the establishment of the first free trade agreement with the United States. Each of these were nation-building moments in history where Canadians took control of our economic destiny, and we seized to build a better future. Well, I think we are at a crossroads in history today that is crying out for that same leadership. The decisions we make now will be critical for laying the economic foundation for the next 30 years or more, because we're facing big challenges. Last week marked 2 years since China confirmed its first COVID death and the pandemic was set upon us. And the virus has infected over 300 million worldwide now. And just a few days ago, the US set a global record of over 1.3 million new cases in a single day. And of course, that's just what was reported. Now, to their credit, our Canadian federal government stepped up to provide urgent support for businesses and people in Canada, as did the provinces. But the fact is, this health crisis caused an economic crisis, the likes of which we haven't experienced in a generation or more, and the impacts will be felt for many years. At the same time, climate change is clearly accelerating and having devastating impacts around the planet. And we saw those impacts firsthand right here in Teck's home province of British Columbia this past year. We had an unprecedented heat wave, all-time record temperatures beyond what had even been imagined before. Where I was, it was 44 degrees 3 days in a row. Then we had wildfires that caused enormous damage and displacement, followed not long after by rains and flooding, atmospheric rivers that shut down roads and rail lines, costing billions of dollars and causing damage that will take years to fully repair. It cost our company hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And then all-time record cold temperatures that yet again caused enormous disruption and damage. These impacts underscore how critical it is for all of us to be focused on taking action on climate change. And Canada has a lot to offer the world in this fight, but only if we can collectively recognize one critical truth, and that is climate change is not just an environmental challenge, it is also an economic one. Too often, people view the economy and climate as separate, competing priorities, weighing one versus the other, and this is a false and frankly counterproductive approach. To grow our economy in a net zero world and to make a meaningful difference to address climate change, Canada's climate plan must be its economic plan, and Canada's economic plan must be its climate plan. Because a global clean economic transformation is well underway. Over 130 nations representing 73% of global emissions have adopted or are considering net zero commitments, and Canada is a leader in that regard. And already 1/5 of the world's largest companies have committed to net zero as well, including Teck and RBC and many other members of the Business Council. The ambition that Canada has shown on climate file is commendable, and it's heading in the right direction. But there's much more we can and should do, because the low carbon future doesn't just happen because you want it to, it has to be built. And that requires resources. Global demand for raw materials is only going to increase, driven by the low carbon transition. The global net zero transition is expected to trigger a green economy supercycle. Projected growth over the next 30 years ranges between 50% and 300% in agriculture, energy, forest products, metals, and minerals. Electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, renewable power, low carbon infrastructure like rapid transit, all of it requires significantly higher resource inputs. For example, an electric car requires 6 times the mineral input of a gas-powered car. A wind power facility requires 9 times more mineral resources than a typical gas-fired plant. Think about that. Most people think the energy transition will require less metal. Not true, not even close. But that's only half the story. Meanwhile, a growing population and increased urbanization will drive even more global demand. And projections show that 2.5 billion people will move to urban populations by the year 2050, with close to 90% of the increase concentrated in Asia and Africa. And to put that in perspective, that much urbanization is the equivalent of building a new city almost the size of the Greater Toronto Area every single month for the next 30 years. People living in emerging economies want to contribute to climate change, but they also want a better quality of life. They'd like to catch up to us. And that is going to drive tremendous demand for resources, for metals and minerals, forest products, and energy. The kind of resources that we have right here in Canada and that are being produced with amongst the highest environmental and social performance anywhere. In fact, Canada has significant advantages in the race to supply the low carbon transition. We have a robust environmental regime to ensure resource development is responsible. We have the natural resources and raw materials needed to support a global transition, including top 10 reserves of transition-relevant metals and minerals. Canada's clean tech companies are world-leading, with 45% growth in the number of those companies between 2011 and 2019. Our steel, wood, fertilizer, cement, metals, and minerals are amongst the world's cleanest, thanks to an 83% emissions-free electricity grid. A 2019 report by the Business Council of British Columbia shows that BC's energy and commodity exports contain just half of the carbon content of those of their global competitors. And Canadian governments and companies are working hard to build on that performance and to drive down emissions even further. Canada could be the world's clean growth powerhouse, making the low carbon transition happen with the cleanest resources possible. But we need to lean into that potential, because if we don't, others will. I was at the COP26 conference in Glasgow this past November. I met a lot of people, really intelligent, hardworking, passionate, hearts in the right place people who genuinely care about tackling climate change. But the truth is that the approach a lot of them want to take will only make it worse, will only hurt the planet, because they're narrowly focused on just the supply side of the equation, and frankly, the good supply side itself, the supply side that's run by Western publicly listed companies with good transparency and run by responsible leaders. But I get it. It's a lot easier to focus on decarbonizing supply than it is to try and change demand. It wouldn't be very popular for political leaders to tell voters that they can now only drive their car on Sunday and Thursday, they can only eat meat once a month, and they can no longer order from Amazon because the trucks aren't allowed on the road to deliver. But I think some of these folks might have skipped Economics 101, because as you know, reducing supply doesn't make demand go away. Demand is demand. It just means that the supply will come from somewhere else. And in this case, it will come from less environmentally responsible producers in jurisdictions with weaker climate and social policy, and the world will literally be worse off. Sadly, in energy, if we continue to focus on decarbonizing supply without the equivalent decarbonization of demand, energy prices will skyrocket, and literally billions of innocent people in developing economies will be very badly hurt. No one should feel good about themselves for doing that. So if we fail to act on this opportunity to supply Canada's responsible low-carbon resources to the world, then all we've done is ensure that bad actors will benefit, while we in Canada miss out on jobs and economic opportunities for Canadians. If Canada is not participating on the supply side, the world and the climate will be worse off, and we will be worse off economically, which benefits nobody. Now, the good news is that we have all of the competitive pieces to address climate change, to stimulate economic growth, and to build a nation where our kids can thrive. And we'll talk more about these strengths shortly in the panel discussion. From agriculture to finance to oil and gas, we'll hear how Canadian businesses are leading the way when it comes to sustainability and innovation. But we will need to work closely with governments to help put all the pieces together. First, we need a Canadian clean industrial strategy, underpinned by policies and investments that make us competitive in supplying those products to domestic and international markets, and that incentivizes and supports industries to further decarbonize and improve performance. And we need to market, we need to tell our story about our competitive low carbon advantages, both to the world and also here at home, where the discourse around development is often so polarized and so inaccurate. Second, we need to be better at bringing responsible new supply online. Since 2006, Canada has fallen from 4th to 23rd place in the annual World Bank study that measures the regulatory burden on business. Certainty for investors, not necessarily access to capital, but certainty is currently the biggest barrier. And that means having predictable and timely regulatory processes that expedite projects that are clean, responsible, and contribute to a net zero carbon world. Third, we need to advance reconciliation and ensure that Indigenous peoples share fully in the benefits of responsible growth. As recently noted by Tabitha Bull, the CEO of Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, Indigenous partnerships will play a critical role in the low-carbon transition. And fourth, we need transformational investments in green infrastructure to build on our clean resource advantage. A recent RBC report estimated it will require an investment of $2 trillion in the next 3 decades to decarbonize Canada. We need investments in expanding electrification. We need to double down on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and other decarbonization technologies. And these would be true nation-building projects, just like the Transcontinental Railway and the St. Lawrence Seaway were, the kind of bold action that could jumpstart our economy for decades to come. Look, it will be hard work, and it will require every segment of society to pull together to make it happen. But the opportunity is enormous. The potential to kickstart an era of economic growth that benefits not just Canada, but the world. Because the resources we produce are essential and demand is only going to increase. And if we don't produce them here, they will come from dirtier suppliers while we miss out on jobs and economic opportunities for Canadians. Barack Obama notably said when he addressed our Canadian Parliament that the world needs more Canada. And he was right. Because every ton of copper or steelmaking coal or LNG, every board of lumber, every ounce of resource exported from Canada means the world is better off. As a nation, we need to recognize that fact, we need to embrace it, and we need to be proud of the role that we can play on the world stage while building our clean economy at home. The world needs more Canada, because more Canada means more action on climate change, more sustainable resource development, more jobs, more prosperity, and a better world for everyone. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Nadia now.
Thank you so much, Don, for setting us up so nicely to have a conversation that I have been so looking forward to having since the moment that I knew that we were going to be here, albeit virtually today. Your remarks are really the scene setter that we need to have what I know is going to be a lively discussion today. So, but before we dig in, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that today, January 17th, is a day of commemoration and tribute for both Raoul Wallenberg, who, as we all know, is a humanitarian who put his life in jeopardy to save 100,000 Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust. And it is also a commemoration day for Martin Luther King Jr., who is the most visible spokesperson and leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, and who has a special relationship with Canada as well. And, you know, for many of us participating today, the courage and the work of those two men in history are really a big part of the reason why we stand here today, where we are. So I think it's important to take a moment to acknowledge them both. So let's dig in. You know, Don, your opening remarks, you underscored, and I think that we can all agree that Canada, in order to seize this opportunity ahead of us, this economic opportunity, needs a different playbook. We need a different playbook to move forward on this transition, because the current approach, the approach that we have been applying for the past decades, won't work. So I'm going to open this up to everybody to kind of give your opening remarks and maybe your level set about, how do we do things differently? What does a different playbook look like? And I'm also going to challenge you to get specific if you can, share an example or two of what different actually looks like in a sector or an industry view. And I'll start with Dave, and then I'll turn to Susannah, then Karn, and then I'll let Don give any remarks that he might have on the question as well.
Well, thanks, Nadia, and thank you for acknowledging those two great leaders that we're commemorating today, Martin and Raoul. Certainly it's a great setup by Don, and I'm pleased to share the stage with Susannah, Karn, and Don today. when I think about so many of the challenges that Don laid out in his speech and that we've talked about, significantly over the past 6 months, when you're trying to attract upwards of $2 trillion of capital just to manage the supply side of emissions, when you're trying to manage the geopolitical nature of energy, as we see, whether it's emerging nations needing access to the resources and wanting to improve their standard of living, as Don pointed out, or the challenges that we're facing in Europe over access to energy sources like natural gas. When you're trying to mobilize capital, one of the current constructs that gets talked about, but I feel has shortcomings, is the market will solve it. If you put a price on carbon, a carbon tax, then the market will allocate resources appropriately. But when you're trying to solve for Indigenous inclusion and partnership, when you're trying to solve for technologies that are emerging that may not be economic but have huge promise, then the market won't necessarily be efficient or be able to allocate capital to solve the problems in the most optimal way for Canada, which in itself is a small country competing in a very large global world. And therefore, we have to use our resources smartly. We have to organize them. We have to prioritize them, and we have to focus. So when you look at specifically to your question, what construct needs to act in partnership with markets and carbon pricing and capture, I think what this country needs is an organizing principle around a public-private consortium that supersedes political cycles, because we're making long-term investment decisions, long-term multi-generational coordinating decisions that require confidence, that require policies to supersede political change, that supersede CEO and economic cycles because of the duration that we're moving. These consortiums, if you're looked specifically at transportation energy, do you green the grid before you accelerate the conversion of your light trucks and your recreational vehicle fleet, or do you have demand policy incentives to quickly convert your fleet, and then you may be required to double or triple the capacity of your grid in a less than green way? These are all important strategic decisions that may get you to your goal in 2050 and along different paths. Who makes those decisions? Who decides how to manage supply versus demand? It's beyond markets to do that in isolation. Some of the capabilities that we're going to need transcend across Indigenous territory. That's going to require their participation and consent. So I would argue for a public-private consortium. These are almost wartime strategies and activities that we need that supersede the current economy and need to be thought through. So I would put that construct out there in my opening comments.
I love that, Dave, and especially coming from business and industry, this idea to actually put forward the idea that a market-based solution is not the only solution and that we do need more. I think that's so powerful and really speaks to the urgency and the emergency of the issue as Don laid out. Susannah.
Thank you, Nadia. And you might be surprised to know that I'm calling in from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And the sun has come out here in beautiful Vancouver. And so I'm a bit spotlighted, as are you, Karn. But really, it's a pleasure to be here. And Don, thank you for the opportunity. A wise person once said that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think that's consistent, essentially, with what you were saying, Dave. I think we all start from the premise that capitalism is all about market forces. Well, in the situation that we find ourselves in today, when we're trying to accelerate change, and the market itself will not enable that to go at the pace for the turnover of technology that we need in the incumbent energy system that's been around for a century, we need to do something different. And so policy frameworks are core to that. And for Shell, of course, we've set as a company some pretty aggressive net zero targets with an ambition to be net zero by 2050. And the key differentiator for us is that's across scope 1, 2, and 3. Now, people sometimes challenge us and say scope 3, which is really our customers' emissions. How and why do you care about that? Well, we care about that because that enables us to work from our customers back. It enables us to look across a supply chain and say, what will it take for you to get to net zero, which then allows us to get to net zero, or to decarbonize so that we can find our own pathway to net zero. And 90% of the emissions that we need to tackle come from our customers. So scope 3. And so Don, what you were saying, which I was really in agreement with, is for so long we focused on the supply side. green up the supply side, reduce the carbon intensity of your fuels. Well, we can do that. And even here in Vancouver, we've had a couple of hydrogen refueling stations for a period of time. Nobody's filling up their cars yet. A few maybe are. Maybe Minister Wilkinson, who still drives a hydrogen car. But the challenge is, until the consumers change what they're driving, then we can produce all the green hydrogen that you want. However, if they're not buying it, there's no return on that investment. So what we have to do is look at each piece of that ecosystem and say, what will it take? A key area, for example, hydrogen is one of those areas where we're looking at quite aggressively for essentially medium and heavy duty trucking. When we speak to truckers, when we speak to those companies, they're saying, look, first of all, the infrastructure is not there. So why am I going to invest in the trucks? Second of all, the trucks are more expensive. I have all these existing trucks here. Why can't I just decarbonize the fuel for that? And then third, my customers aren't going to pay a premium, for me to make these investments. So 3 great examples of where we can apply policy to help transition heavy duty and medium duty trucking. And that's about 9% of global emissions that we need to address. So what do? Well, we take a very dedicated look at what are some of those regulatory frameworks we can employ. First of all, you need to set clear CO2 emissions performance standards. To the extent that those can become global, well, that's fantastic, because a lot of these trucking companies happen to be global. Better for these standards to be somewhat global, but they need to be regionally specific with what can we actually provide over time? How much hydrogen can we create in time for these vehicles and these trucks to actually consume it? They also need to be, obviously, these trucks incentivized. What will it take for the trucking companies to turn over some of these trucks, to send the trucks that they have into the secondary market? And then we can talk about the secondary market in terms of how do we then decarbonize that fuel source. So there's a number of different things that we need to start off with. I would even say that one of the other areas that's important to take a look at is how are we using taxation policy, for example, that looks at the carbon intensity of the fuels that we all consume. So there's additional work that we can put on there. But the short of it is, as I think what Dave said, is market won't get there alone, especially on an accelerated basis. We need to create markets, and we do that with the right types of incentive structures. And the key thing that I'd also maybe just in my remarks in saying is there has been such a change over the course of the last 2 years in terms of demand for lower carbon energy. And that is a game changer. Because as I said before, we've been talking about carbon pricing, and we've had a carbon price at Shell for more than 20 years. But now customers are saying, we want lower carbon fuels. Well, now you're creating an end-to-end opportunity, which I agree with what Don was saying. Canada can hit above its weight in terms of delivering against.
Absolutely. And, thank you, Susannah, for highlighting both regulatory frameworks and the work we need to do around regulatory frameworks and taxation. 2 key issues that oftentimes, aren't the sexy things to talk about, but in fact are going to be the key and the core at really moving us from opportunity to reality in creating the market, as you rightly put it. So 2 very, very key issues that I thank you for kind of putting on the table. Karn, over to you.
Thanks, Nadia. And I really want to hit on this important point that I think that Don brought up on supply and demand, and Dave and Susannah hit on, and just zooming that this concept of supply and demand out. We look at the issues with climate change right now, and a lot of the focus is around the supply and increasing emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere each year, around 70 billion tons of carbon dioxide. But if you look at the demand of the debt of that carbon in the atmosphere, we have close to 1 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere, and we have to get some of that out to really be able to make a difference in turning back the clock here. So if we look at where the Earth's stores of carbon are, the Earth's soil contains about 2.5 trillion tons, about 3 times more than the Earth's atmosphere. And carbon isn't a bad in itself. It's actually the source of life. We're all carbon life forms. Plants, the Earth are based on carbon life forms. The problem right now is a question of balance. So every day, carbon moves between the Earth's atmosphere, the Earth's soil, oceans, the biosphere. And our croplands and pastures have actually been depleted of a lot of the carbon that was once in that soil. About half of it has been lost in the industrial age. And that affects the resiliency of our biospheres, our land, our ability to withstand droughts and floods, but also the productivity of our food supply. Different can be as simple as evolving farm practices and our practices to actually draw down carbon out of the atmosphere and into the soil. So, our croplands and pastures have the ability to draw down, as much carbon as at least as we've lost, and at rates, ranging from about 0.4 to 2.5 tons of carbon per acre per year. So assuming it takes us about 100 years to fully exploit the opportunity, that translates to about 10 to 25 billion tons of carbon per year, or about 30 to 70% of our current annual emissions. And 10 countries have house about 60% of this drawdown potential. Canada's number 2 on the list, with the potential to draw down at least about 80 billion tons. So when we look at the issues, the supply and demand issues need to be holistic in terms of the issues as well as our opportunities. Much of the carbon that's in the atmosphere used to be terrestrial carbon, either removed from the soil through practices or the use of fossil fuels, but we can actually get that back through better land use and agriculture. So 2 specific things that we actually can do to start moving this on a policy and business level is, first of all, we really need to understand what carbon we have in our soils and the opportunity. And that means baselining and measuring Canada's soil and carbon levels, including both the organic and permanent carbon stocks, and then incentivizing the conservation and increase of soil carbon. For example, like it was a bank. So pay for what's there now, and then incentivize the increased sequestration and charge for what's released. So, really coming back to, across, sectoral opportunity, pulling government and business and industry and agriculture together to fund and finance the good of the benefits, not only to agriculture, but to society as a whole.
Yeah, I love the point that you kind of honed in on, Karn, which is, it's not just about sticks, it's also about carrots, right? It's also about how can we actually incentivize together in this public-private consortium that Dave has set us up on, to actually focus on what is the good and do more of that, and how do we actually move that forward. Don, I'm going to get you to make some remarks as well, and then I'm going to hone us in on some of the specific issue areas that a couple of us have highlighted in the opening remarks, and that are actually directly related to some of the great questions that we're having from the audience. So, Don.
Okay, thanks, Nadia. 2 quick points. One for fun to illustrate some practical aspects of the challenge, and one to follow up on Dave's public-private consortium. So decarbonization is all about electrification, which is all about copper. And that's why I have a copper backdrop today. So 5 years ago, I bought my first Tesla. It had a range of 480 kilometers. I put a charging station on the side of the garage. It has 4 times as much copper as a gas-powered car. I got down to 50 kilometers left. I went and plugged it in, and nothing happened. Now I'm starting to panic. So I call the electrician and say, what do I do? And he said, well, did you flick the switch? Did you pull the lever? I'm like, what lever? And he says, well, go downstairs to where your fuse boxes are. I put in this gray metal cabinet, and there's a big lever on the side. And on the top of it, I wrote on a piece of masking tape, Tesla. And on the bottom, I wrote oven. Because you can either charge your car or you can cook, but you can't do both. And the reason is because there's not enough copper coming in from the street to my house. My house is about 60 years old. And that's the case all over the city. There's that much copper is going to be required to upgrade all the systems to be able to charge EVs and so on. Now, the second point on Dave's public-private consortium, clearly I'm talking about the decarbonizing supply without decarbonizing demand. I'm not saying that we should just keep our supply going Our supply is the good supply. It does displace bad supply elsewhere. But I still believe we need to decarbonize our supply. So I'm proposing that we should be more than doubling down on carbon capture and storage. That just like Sir John A. Macdonald, united the country coast to coast with the Canadian Pacific Railway, a national infrastructure. We should look at carbon capture as a national infrastructure, and we should choose 10 of the most geologically suitable places in the country, coast to coast to coast, and put in the receiving infrastructure. The government should push to put in the receiving infrastructure for carbon capture that Canadian businesses can then link up to cost effectively without the insurmountable capital requirement. And not only that does it promote growth within Canada's domestic economy, but it attracts foreign investments. Foreign investment will look and say, oh, I can deal with the carbon situation. And that will make our good, clean resources even better. That could be a national undertaking done on a private-public partnership basis. So that's what I would hope to see the government lead with.
I am going to your point on carbon capture and storage is such a good one, Don. And we had a question in the audience around it. And it was something that I wanted to actually get the views of the other panelists. So I'm going to actually use that and just ask the other panelists. And I'm going to start with Susannah, and then go to Karn, and then Dave to talk about the carbon capture and storage and give your views on, how do we actually seize the opportunity. We do have a moment to accelerate the technology, accelerate its deployment, accelerate its commercialization, as Don pointed. I do believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We will still have a world that still demands Canadian oil and gas at the same time. And so, how do we, what do we do about that? How do we make sure that the current investment that we are going to make is proportionate to the scale of the current context that we're in?
Sure. Thanks, Nadia. And thanks, Don, for teeing up CCUS. 100%. CCUS is fundamental to almost every credible climate policy that's out there, with an expectation of about 3 gigatons per annum of carbon capture sequestration by 2050. So it's fundamental. From my perspective, Canada, and actually from our company's perspective, Canada and Alberta in particular, is a bit of a mature market, believe it or not. Because we've had carbon capture sequestration for years. We've proven out the technology, that's the capture technology, as well as the transportation and the sequestration. There's kind of 3 different components there. We've proven that you can store CO2 safely underground. The Quest project is a project that we've been operating now for about 6 years, captured about 6 million tons per annum, 6 million tons total now. And that has created a lot of learnings in terms of costs, efficiencies, regulations, construction, the whole host of it. We've got another project on deck called Polaris, and it's a 2-phase project. First project looks to capture carbon from the hydrogen process, essentially through steam methane reforming to create blue hydrogen. And then the second phase is growing that out to a hub to actually provide carbon capture sequestration for other customers in the region who might actually want to be building their own projects, leveraging that. For example, CCS is not only great for capturing emissions as we have them today, maybe scope 1, it's also pretty awesome for blue hydrogen and fundamental for it, actually. And so in addition to what Don was saying, there's an opportunity to grow investment in Canada, creating blue hydrogen on top of CCS hubs. And what Don was saying is absolutely right. CCS is developing on a hub basis, in part because you have existing infrastructure, you have existing emissions, and then you build out. Again, the Polaris project that I can talk about at Scotford in Alberta is a great example. We're attaching CCS to what is already there, and then we're expanding it out to customers. And this is how it's going to work. How do you actually make economics work on this? So there's a few things. And this is why Canada, believe it or not, is kind of viewed as a bit of a mature market globally. We have a carbon price, step 1, and a carbon price which is now pretty attractive to incentivize carbon capture sequestration. Going to $170 a ton, that's a pretty good market signal, regulatory signal. The second piece is, can we actually generate lower carbon intensive fuels that then have a premium associated with them under the Clean Fuel Standard? two pretty important things that help us take a look at carbon capture sequestration in Canada different than other markets. Other markets are doing other things, other policy levers, such as incentive tax structures or tax incentives. And I think, again, for us, there's already the foundational attributes in Canada to develop CCS. We should be a global player. We already are. We're a mature market. But again, I think the takeaway here too is that it creates new business opportunities to grow beyond just carbon capture sequestration, to actually look at new investment in things like hydrogen and blue hydrogen, serving some of these other markets we can talk about.
Yeah. Karn?
Oops. Thanks, Nadia. I'm going to focus on nature-based solutions. And I think soil capture, as I was mentioning earlier, soil capture and nature-based solutions is an enormous opportunity for Canada. Canada, as I mentioned, has the second largest potential store in the world. And increasing soil carbon is good for the economy, for resilience of our lands and our food systems, as well as for climate solutions. So if we look at the potential of increasing soil carbon, a 1% increase in soil carbon will hold around 150,000 liters of water per acre. That makes, and that's a small percentage of how much we can actually increase. We know that we can increase carbon by 1 to 3% or more in our lands. But 1% will hold around 150,000 liters more of water. That makes the land more resilient to drought and hold more water in heavy rain events like we've had here in British Columbia in the last year. That really focuses not only on climate solutions, but in our ability to actually adapt to the situations that we're going to be facing, that we've faced, that we're going to be facing more and more in the years ahead. But the economic opportunity is also massive in soil capture. Studies have shown that by building soil health in agriculture, farm profits increase by around $100 per acre per year in corn. And corn's not a very high value crop. But if you use that as an average, the potential for Canada's farmland is about $16 billion in higher profits in GDP per year. So, there's real opportunities that Canada has in really focusing on measuring our soil carbon levels and incentivizing and mobilizing the capture of carbon in our soils.
Dave?
For us to maintain our prosperity as Canadians, we have to make things the world wants. And we've made automobiles, we've made energy, we've produced goods, services, and we've exported food. As we think about the world transitioning, to Don's point, the economy and the environment managed together, the world is making different decisions about where to get its energy from and its food. You look at this, I was on a call for 2 hours this morning with a group of European leaders across continent, and their discussion was that they've now, as of January 1st, defined natural gas to be green. But green only if you can prove how you reduce your scope 1 and 2 to 0. And therefore, in front of us lies this enormous opportunity to feed the world in a green way, to Karn's point, and to Susannah's point, to export zero scope 1 and 2 products using carbon capture. And these decisions are being made right now. We've missed opportunities where over the last decade, even under the Obama administration, where the Americans grew their export capability of natural gas tenfold, yet Canada canceled more projects than we approved. We missed an entire generation of opportunity, but in front of us is a second chance to provide green energy, to replace brown energy, to help the world towards its net zero by 2050. And on top of it, the second dimension is an ESG, there's an S, the social good. Not only can we produce zero scope 1 and 2 emission energy, but we do it in a socially friendly and positive way. And therefore, Canada has this unique opportunity, but only if we move with purpose and speed, because others are building that capability and those decisions, whether it's Germany and others around Nord Stream, they're reaching out now. Who has a solution for the next 30 years for me? Canada has to be there.
Dave, I'm going to come back to you. right away, because your point around LNG actually speaks to a question that we got from the audience, and you touched on it, and I just want you to maybe double click on it a little bit, because the question from the audience was, and you said it yourself, LNG in Canada, except for maybe the LNG Canada project, has not been entirely successful. And so, the question is, could this affect Canada's position in the new energy sector? I think you would say resoundingly yes. And then the most interesting part of the question is, what are the current technical barriers for Canada in this new energy sector, and other barriers that we need to overcome in order to seize the opportunity. So I'll put that back to you, Dave, and then get Don's comments as well on that. I would love to hear Don's comments on that as well. And then Susannah and Karn, if we've got time.
Well, as I said, we've missed an opportunity in the past for a number of political reasons, and national economic reasons. We have to lay the infrastructure for the future. We have to do it in an inclusive way with Indigenous communities as partnerships. We've demonstrated that in so many ways with the newer projects that are coming online, despite some of the misunderstandings about them. There has been a great inclusion along the way. And we have to continue to do that. We have to lay the infrastructure. We're behind in laying that infrastructure. But there are many more reasons to do that today than I think there were a decade ago when we started this. This isn't self-serving. This is about protecting our sovereignty as far as security and safety. It's about helping our partners. It's about greening our planet and our country. All these objectives are in front of us. Therefore, the variables have changed. And the severity of variables, we need tax incentives to do that and a long-term tax infrastructure. So I think that the decisions we made a decade ago or 5 years ago were in one context. And I think in front of us, given this transitionary journey that we're on, there's a completely different context to revisit some of the decisions we've made.
Don?
Yeah, I agree with what Dave has been saying, but as I said in my opening remarks, this takes all of us working together, and we are getting a second chance, as Dave said, to make some key decisions to build a national infrastructure. I think of it as a carbon capture grid, the same as we have a power grid, and that the government really should lead. We've seen the government demonstrate that it can spend $100 billion here and $100 billion there. While tax incentives are good and a rising carbon tax are good, I think we need more than that. We need the government to actually come with real capital and get that initial receiving infrastructure done coast to coast to coast. And that'll still be done as a public-private partnership. Private companies will be doing their share as well. But the Canadian people want it faster. Like the people of the world want it faster. And the fastest way we can make a real difference and get to zero scope 1 and 2 product that we sell to the world, the happier those voters will be. So I would call upon the Canadian government to take that next step.
We have 4 minutes, really 3 minutes, but I'm pretending we have 4, because there are four of you. And I want to give you the opportunity to give one final call to action, key takeaway, be it for the industry, be it for government, be it for the Canadian public, to really get us to where we need to be in the future. What's the one sort of call to action that you would give? I'm going to go Dave, Susannah, Karn, and then I'm going to give Don the last word.
Well, thanks, Nadia. I'll be brief. I'm going to think a bit of a different one, climate literacy. As Canadians, we all have a responsibility to become climate literate. This is a multi-generational journey with complex decisions that we have to be literate from all Canadians. We're taking on a responsibility as RBC to help carbon and climate literacy in Canada, but all Canadians have to become literate because we have to make decisions about how we're going to run this country together. And this is a complex journey. So carbon and climate literacy, I think, is a requirement for all Canadians.
Susannah?
Tough one. I think climate literacy, energy literacy as well. And I think maybe the fundamental thing I would say is this, is that we're not shutting down fossil fuels today. What we are doing is creating a transition from fossil fuels by decarbonizing them while we scale up new technologies and ecosystems that can take these renewable energy products, whether that's electricity, whether that's hydrogen, whether it's waste to energy, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel. So there is a transition. On the backbone of that are some pretty rigorous climate targets. In order to make that transition happen faster, we need to apply surgically and manage regionally the actual ecosystem we're trying to change. And so that is going to require collaboration like we have never seen before. I think Dave mentioned this is like a wartime or post-wartime effort. 110% it is. And we need to remove the political barriers. We need to remove the regulatory barriers. We need to lean in, as Don said, each one of us, each player in that ecosystem, and say, what will it take? We have seen some of this already transpire from Shell's perspective in Europe, in the hydrogen pathway, hydrogen acceleration, as an example. We hear what our customers are telling us. Let's listen, let's lean in, let's solve, and let's get going.
Karn.
Thanks. And I just want to say, I think one of the things that holds us back really is vilifying certain areas of industry. What we need to do is look at where we are today and how we get to a positive outcome. And I think one of the key things is we've got to look at that carbon as an issue of balance. And how do we start getting the system back into balance? And what infrastructure do we need to be able to get from here to there? I think I want to just talk about the infrastructure issue, just make two quick points. Look, if we had $1 billion, $1 to $4 billion to move fast and deploy technology and digital infrastructure, and say $4 to $10 billion to incent carbon that is actually sequestered in the ground, we could really run and lead in the country and actually only pay for those outcomes. So you really have an opportunity to crowdsource the whole country and have inclusion in our ability to say, how do we really move fast? How do we take this as an opportunity to find the best ways to be able to understand how we best introduce and sequester carbon in soils? And if you look at that as an opportunity and say you've deployed $10 billion and your outcome is $16 billion in increased economic output in agriculture alone, that's not a bad investment over the next 10 years and it's $16 billion year to year. I think for individuals, it's, one thing that for folks interested in nature-based solutions is learn about it, and learn about the soil structure, regenerative agriculture, and make demands on where your food is coming from, and at the store asking about what are regeneratively grown options are available. That creates the actual demand and pull to pull it through the system.
Love it. Don, last word to you.
Thank you. Well, I love Dave's literacy point and what Karn just said about education. We've clearly got to do that in spades across the country. But in the end, being cognizant of the decarbonizing supply without decarbonized demand point that I made earlier, I call for a nation-building investment similar to the Transcontinental Railway, where the government, working in partnership with private sector, builds a national carbon capture grid to launch this country on a trajectory that will get us there faster, which is what the Canadian people want.
Thank you, all of you, all four of you, for what was a riveting conversation. I have only one souci, and that was that we didn't have enough time. We need a part two. So I'm putting that out on the table. And with that, I am going to now turn it over to Kent Caulfield, who is the ESG Markets Leader and Chief Sustainability Officer at EY. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Karn, Dave, Susannah, and Don for your insights, actionable takeaways, and a wonderfully transparent discussion on how some of Canada's leading companies are progressing on their energy transition journey, and giving examples for how others can follow suit. Your leadership and your voices today were inspiring. If you look at today's panel, you can clearly see from commodities to agriculture, banking, consumer, climate change is everyone's business, and everyone needs to be thinking about it. In his opening comments, Don walked through a long list of severe weather events that so many Canadians experienced this past year. These events cause Canadians to change their day plans, their vacation plans, but for far too many Canadians, these events changed their life. And throughout the panel discussion, we heard about the costs of the energy transition and the investments to come. But most importantly, what I heard is a sense of opportunity and hope. There are lots of great ideas to move forward. We just got to work collaboratively and stay focused on working together. Sustainability is the innovation opportunity of our lifetime. And with businesses, individuals, and communities more inspired than ever to do the right thing, Canada has a tremendous opportunity to collectively create financial, consumer, and societal long-term value for all. Including long-term goals in our collective decision-making and our policy setting is absolutely critical. So again, thanks today for today's speakers. It was an outstanding session, and this extended gratitude to the Canadian Club for driving these important conversations forward. The world does need more Canada, and it needs more Canadian Club too. David, over to you.
Wow, Kent, thank you for that ringing endorsement. I agree. We need more Canada across the world, and we're thrilled that the Canadian Club is a part of Canada's story. Let me thank all of our panelists today for their participation. Nadia, thank you for the expert moderation. I don't know if many of you know, Nadia is also a director and board member here at the Canadian Club. We're very fortunate to have her leadership on our board. We hope that you'll join us for some upcoming events as well, guests. On January 26th, we'll host Mike Catchin, CEO of Wealthsimple, for a conversation on economic and competitive opportunities in fintech, the challenges that tech leaders face, and what they have their sights set on as they grow in Canada and around the world. On January 27th, we'll host a panel of experts for a discussion on the need to catch up on routine immunizations in Canada, with strategies and solutions to increase access and vaccine uptake. I want to thank our sponsors again, EY, PwC, and BLG for sponsoring today's events. Without you, it wouldn't be possible. And to our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications and LiveMeetings.ca for making it possible for us to be here together virtually. Can I say I was very much looking forward to doing this in person, but the snow in Toronto, for those of you who are here today, is another reason why we're so glad we're able to meet virtually. Guests, thank you for joining us. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.